podcast you're about to listen to is from a book series on post-qualitative, new materialist and critical post-humanist research. I'm Karen Murris and chief editor of this new Routledge series. You can find it on the following website, www.postqualitativeresearch.com. This recording is from Edge Entanglements with Mental Health Allyship Research and Practice, a Postqualitative Cartography by Tim Barlott and Jenny Setchell.
Welcome to our continued conversation about Edge Entanglements. I'm Tim Barlott, and I'm joined by my co-author Jenny Setchell and our friend and colleague Paint Fremmerlid. We've been using a tarot deck created by Paint as a creative stimulus for our conversation about the book. This is entirely unscripted and unplanned. Excuse the excessive ums that signal that the direction of our conversation is always emerging. At the end of the last podcast, we started to talk about creative impulses of desire. Specifically, we're discussing the desire for a people to come, a desire that animates our writing and our scholarship.
It's a very hopeful message.
It is that that people to come always makes me, really, maybe it's the same thing that you were just saying, Paint, that longing really for more of this sort of dripping with joyful and collective affection, it makes me sort of sad sometimes to realize that's not sometimes not big parts of our lives. But also this feeling of hopefulness that the book speaks to around these things happen and they're possible, and we can. I think that desire, that longing, can lead us there to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
I think I had a hard time engaging with the book fully because that type of longing, especially for me, is very heavy and troublesome, and I've got this kind of bitterness, right? So it's like I'm reading this, I'm like, this is great, I love this is cool, this is awesome, but at the same time I'm like, is it like inspiration porn-esque? And I'm like, no, I don't think it is, but I had this hesitation and this moment and this pause that made it hard for me to keep going, because there's an intimacy to the book, which is good. We need kind of like intimate stories about relationships and ways in which relationships between service providers and people who are experiencing care could be, and how they can change and all that. But it's still even hard to engage with the topic. Like, even if it's presented well, it's still a hard topic to engage with for me personally.
There's one aspect of the chapter that follows after this that I wonder if I could bring it in. I don't think we need to give an overview of that next chapter, but it draws to our attention that there's a mythology of togetherness, that there are some points in the earlier chapters where it seemed like these relationships were entirely affirmative, that these relationships were two people who are in this together. There's a sense of where an ally could take on the struggle of the other as their own, to take on the oppression and constraints of psychiatrized folks as their own. But when we looked at, there's a quote from Felix Guattari, who's one of the philosophers that we used, where they warn us and remind us of not to founder in the besotting mythology of togetherness, that allies can never fully be in that struggle that psychiatrized folks in the book are experiencing. And I think it's even relates to the idea of the people to come, that being in the struggle with someone is forever the limit. It can't ever be achieved. It's always kind of a becoming. It's forever on the horizon. It just reminds me that it's this ongoing process of and struggle to be in something together with someone who experiences hardship. I don't know how that fits for you, Paint.
I mean, I think what you're saying is true in the sense that relationships are never static, right? They're always going to be changing because you're changing, the other person's changing. So there's this like there's always, you can always make it more just, right? Like justice is never achieved. You can always make it closer, right? And that's, I think, one of the symbolisms that I really like to think of sometimes is like a sword of justice or a knife. And in my deck, I use keys instead of swords. But like this idea that justice, like the more influence, the more reach, the more anything that you're doing, the more you have to be attuned to this sort of knife or this force of justice. And you have to be kind of like accommodating it and caring for it. And so I think that the justice is similar to the relationships in that like they develop and they change and you fine tune how we are with others. But it's never going to be perfect, and not perfect isn't the goal. The goal is just always to be able to improve and to be open to improvement.
And I think bringing in that justice concept speaks to something that we tried to thread throughout the book, and is that concept of power, really, this kind of dispersed concept of power, and how it operates through sort of these, what we're talking about in the second chapter, sort of apparatuses of capture or dominant kind of major forces, and how disrupting that capture is really not ever anything that can be entirely achieved, but it's always in process as well. So when we're thinking about the justice element, it's also a process. I agree. And we did talk about idealism in the book, didn't we, Tim, as we went along? Something challenging to not be binary about it ourselves, about these relationships that we were exploring. So, yeah.
Because the relationships were not without challenges, were not without difficulties at times. The first card that we drew, that there's a nurturing element to that first card, but something that came up at times in the relationships we talk about in the book is that there can also be a paternalism in allyship, where an ally acts like they know, or they're the protector, which reinforces the boundary of helper and the one being helped or supported. And so these relationships, we're kind of always swinging in this balance of a friendship, a kinship, and one of support. But there was a flexibility there. And they didn't become rigid in either direction. They swung back and forth. And so I was thinking about the quote that you just said, Jenny, from going right back to the first chapter we were talking about, chapter 2, about this idea of disrupting binaries, disrupting axes of power, and disrupting linear processes is not something that's achieved. there's not a solution. Just like in doing this type of writing and this type of research, that there's not a way to do it and to do it right. There's not about doing it right or doing it wrong. It's about experimenting and always kind of having that justice on the horizon, the people to come on the horizon, and that disruption is always that ongoing process that we commit to.
There's this quote that I just landed on that I really like from chapter 7, if I can read it.
Go for it.
Yeah, the active force of allies was disrupted by a minor gesture, leading to the development of an atypical ally-friend relationship. This ally-friend relationship, where allies enter into a zone of proximity with a minor reactive force, inhabit an intermezzo in-between space that vibrates with potential. I really love the vibrates with potential a lot.
And that's one of the things that kind of came up in the book, that, and in these relationships, is that these relationships that fluctuated, that were both careless and careful, and the hierarchy or lack of hierarchy was flexible and soft, that it led to this in-between space where relationships were in this in-between. And it was in that in-betweenness, in that in-betweenness of imagining the people to come, imagining a future to come, was that space that vibrated with creative potential. Thanks for sharing that quote, Paint.
Yeah, it reminds me of the whole context of the book, really, which we haven't spoken to that much, but really it's about systems that have flexibility built within them. So, often the relationship between someone who's supposed to be caring for someone who's psychiatrized is quite a formalized relationship, right? There's an office and there's a set amount of time, or there's walls that these things happen within. Whereas these relationships between peers or allies, in this case, some may be peers, don't sit within walled boundaries or offices or professional accreditations. There's this room for this flexibility, for that, and that's how that kind of those possibilities are at least much more at hand, I guess, as compared to these more structured relationships that are more typical when people are diagnosed with severe mental illness, which was the label that people had been prescribed in this, the people that Tim worked with in this study. So
I want to go back to my second card. I didn't describe it, so I'm just going to describe it real quick. It's a person holding a shield, looking to the side with like a staff. There's a brick wall that's being built beside them, and there's also like a ladder in the background that's going up really, really tall. And I think something that's coming up for me in this conversation around boundaries, and I think is an important thing for people to consider, and is how there's this, like, for me, it's like I can easily say, like, I'm a very bitter person about psychiatry. I'm a very bitter person about the mental health care system. And like understanding that in between these relationships that are so full of potential, right? Like if you're able to get someone who feels like a genuine ally to you, and that could have a real transformative power in your life. But if you haven't had that, or every time you've asked for that, you've been disappointed, then those walls get built up, and it is harder to ask for care. It is harder to accept care, and it is harder to trust people who may be even new to the whole world. They haven't ever been in this kind of role before. They've never abused power, but it doesn't matter because those experiences and those boundaries are already built up, that you have to kind of navigate to get to that place where you can find that creative potential.
Mm. Mm-hmm. And if we link that back to some of the, I guess, our hopes in the book, is for the reader to imagine relationships otherwise, to imagine a different relationality, whether it be in clinical practice, in professional practice, in community relationships, in ways that might slowly break down some of those boundaries that have been harmful.
There's like this process of rebuilding trust that has to happen too, alongside any kind of creative potential relationship thing to work, right?
Yeah, it's very hard to be creative if you're not trusting, isn't it? And I think like that's the lovely thing about these relationships, because they're outside of the institutional space almost entirely. So there's not that association with a psychiatrist, for example, where there may have been harm, or there's been harm for other people that's kind of known about over time. So that's in this case. But yeah, I think like you're saying, Paint and Tim, that for people who are working in those more defined roles, and those officers to think about, that it's all very well to imagine these new ways of creativity with people, but that it can't happen in situations where there's not trust. So absolutely there'd be some need to shift that. I agree.
Yeah, I think I just really wanted to highlight that, knowing that this is hopefully going to be read by people who aren't just in the types of relationships that are in your book, but are in other types of relationships in which they're interacting with people who may be experiencing mental health trauma, or all those things, right? And I hope that the stories about looking at different ways to have relationships can maybe reframe stuff for people and like help that imagining and that imaginative process.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you would like to know more about this chapter, please visit the website www.postqualitativeresearch.com, and please stay tuned for future podcasts.